Do you ever find something out that you wish you hadn't? I have, and let me tell you, it ain't pretty. I want to just say first up, even though I know you're not listening, Mom, I don't blame you for telling me this. You did the right thing in telling me, even though I wish that you'd never had to. But good God, I gotta get this off my chest, and I figured sending in a story to the internet anonymously is as good a way as any to do that. And please do keep me anonymous. It all started out around 6 months ago. Well, I guess it started when I was born, but we'll get to that. My mom, God love her, was diagnosed with breast cancer a couple of years ago. She's doing good at the moment, it's in remission, but it led her to think about mortality a lot lately. And I guess word of her diagnosis also go back to my birth father, who I haven't seen since I was 13 months old. And so I get this Facebook message from a profile I'm not friends with, but I know who it is immediately. It was my biological dad, or at least someone pretending to be him. I can recognize him from the name, even though I never took his last name, and from the handful of photos I've seen of him. Now curious, I accepted the message request, even though all Mom would ever say about him was that he was a bad POS and there was no chance that I'd hear from him ever again. Well, I guess she got that wrong, because there I was talking to my dad on Facebook. He was asking about Mom, said that he'd heard about her diagnosis, only 18 months late. Good one, Dad. Now he made some noise suggesting that he was genuinely interested in her health, although I could tell that he wasn't. And then he got to the real purpose of messaging me. Did I want to resume contact with him maybe? Perhaps get to know him? Well, at this point I still didn't exactly know why he was a POS, as she said, just that he supposedly was, and so I told him that I'd need to think about it. I figured if he was genuine, he'd be fine with it. He was, sort of. He said that was okay, and then added, but don't take too long. I think he was trying to imply that he had some health scare going on, and the whole way he talked, it was like those people who love implying mystery and drama and want you to ask about it rather than coming out and saying it. I could already tell that my biological dad was not someone that I would get along well with. I just needed a good reason to tell him no. Naturally, the first person I told that bio-dad had reached out to me was my mom, and the look of horror on her face said it all. At first, all she said is, no, 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 do not talk to that man. But then I told her, as gently as I could, that I needed more. It wasn't that I didn't trust her, not at all, but after all these years, I'd really like to have a reason to tell the man whose DNA I shared to just go kick sand. Mom looked like she was about to argue, and then she kind of deflated and said that, yeah, she guessed that I did have every right to know. And it's not like I was a little boy now. I was a grown man who was about to start a family of his own, and it was probably for the best if I knew why my biological father was just a piece of crap. And so the short version, he was going to kill me when I was just a year old. Now the slightly longer version, because that's not very satisfying, my bio-dad was a player. He slept around and never intended to settle down. Mom was young when she hooked up with him, and in her words, it was foolish and naive, and bio-dad, being the kind of man that he was, didn't use protection and relied on Mom to take the morning after pill. She did, but it didn't work, and thus, I was conceived. My biological father swore that he'd do right by her, and before I was born, they were married. And at first, things seemed like they were going to go just fine. Dad seemed to settle down as a person, and I was born a healthy baby boy, exactly 7 pounds, and an easy delivery. It took 6 months for Dad to go back to his old ways. According to him, he just couldn't help it. He needed more than one woman, but he still wanted to stay married to Mom and be a father to me. She just kind of had to compromise by letting him be the free spirit he was born to be, I suppose. No, obviously, she said no, and after a few months of bio-dad giving monogamy a half-assed try, Mom caught him with another woman yet again and threw him out. The next part, she wouldn't really tell me the details, only that she was forced to stay with her brothers after discovering that Dad had a plan in place to kidnap and kill me as revenge for being thrown out. Supposedly his plan was foolproof, and he'd never even be suspected of the crime. but considering Mom somehow found out, then I imagine he would have been busted within minutes. It scared Mom enough, though, that she took me and hid out with her brothers, who apparently would have beaten him within an inch of his life if he'd come even close to me, and I'm very glad that he never did. As an epilogue, I blocked him on Facebook that same day, and I've never heard from him again. Hey, let's read. First, let me just say you're my favorite creepy story narrator by far. You might recognize me from the comments section, so I won't say exactly who I am, but I comment on quite a few videos, and I always remember thinking, I hope I never have a reason to write into Joel about myself. Well, about 4 months ago, I had a reason, and that reason was someone named Robbie. I work as a barista at a big chain coffee shop, and I've been with the company for a few years, but only started working at the store that I'm at now around 6 months ago. And that's when I met Robbie. Robbie was kind of a stereotype, really, and the type of dude who might make you roll your eyes a bit. He was quite vocally feminist, claimed to dabble with communism, and had a trust fund but worked as a barista to keep himself busy, quote-unquote. However, he was also very flamboyantly campy, and he pulled off the stereotype with a wink and a smile that couldn't help but make you laugh along with him. And within 2 days of knowing him, he was asking me for advice on how he should propose to his boyfriend. He also had the nickname RoboCop, ironically, because he was the least strict shift manager you'd ever meet. I just found a lot to like about him despite certain aspects that would normally not be my kind of person. Now, we worked together for 2 months and became fast friends. Robbie, myself, and a few of the other baristas started going out for drinks together most weekends, and I even joined their little D&D group. I know. Now, I won't bore you by talking about my character. I never thought that I'd be a TTRPG gal, but I could talk about my orc barbarian pole dancer for days. Now, I met Robbie's boyfriend, Dan, and it was pretty clear that the two of them were truly in love. He wasn't there often, but occasionally he'd join us for drinks at our favorite bar, and when he did, he and Robbie couldn't be parted with a crowbar. Now, the only slightly weird thing was how often Dan would refer to Robbie as devilish and one to keep an eye on. Apparently, Robbie would sweep you off your feet in a heartbeat, although I didn't think that I had anything to worry about with, having girl parts and whatnot, and Robbie being very much into the other type. On top of bragging about what an irresistible guy his boyfriend was, Daniel also made it clear that Robbie was supposedly the world's best cook. One night when we were all out for cocktails, he made Robbie promise to invite me over to dinner sometime soon, and I was only too happy to oblige. I assumed it would be one of those things where promises get made and never followed up on, but the next Tuesday at work, on our next shift together, Robbie issued me a dinner invite for that following Saturday. It would be me, him, and Dan, he said. And I said I'd love to, and Robbie told me to make sure that I dressed sexily, and then tipped me a little cheeky grin, showing off his expensively whitened teeth. Again, creepy from some guys, but funny and cute coming from an openly gay guy like Robbie, I thought. I showed up at the given address just after 8 p.m., a little fashionably late, really, but Robbie greeted me with a hug and air kisses and apologized for the absence of Dan. He was a legal secretary and had been called into work last minute to deal with some major client crisis, apparently. However, hopefully he'd show up in time for dessert, which was to be, according to Robbie, a divine pavlova. Robbie took my coat and showed me around the apartment. It wasn't quite what I'd expected. I think I'd been assuming that he lived in this really bougie, fashionable place. Instead, it was kind of messy, like student digs, and he hadn't really tidied up in preparation for my arrival. But why should he, I guess? If this is how he lived, with Bang energy cans lying around and an Xbox on the coffee table, then let your bro flag fly, really. Now, he had, however, made a real effort with the dining table. The kitchen, dining, and living room were all open plan, and the area with the dining table looked like it belonged to a different apartment. Curtains down to the floor open onto a balcony showing off the famous skyline of the city that I live in. Candles flickered on a beautifully laid out table. There were 2 place settings at either end of the table. Robbie guided me to that seat facing away from the kitchen and pulled out my chair with a flourish after taking my coat. He told me that the food would be ready in minutes and he just had to grab it from the oven. Now, he also told me to be sure not to look so I didn't spoil the surprise of the menu. I sat at the table and waited, listening to the clattery of dishes behind me. Now, as the impatient person I am, I pulled out my phone and realized that I wasn't getting any coverage in that apartment. I turned in my seat to ask Robbie for the Wi-Fi password, and that's when I saw it. He'd poured 2 glasses of champagne, and it very clearly looked like he was sprinkling something into one of the glasses. Surely not, though. But I know what I saw, and I know the signs, and I know how to be wary, no matter how camp and gay your dinner date might be. When Robbie came back in, he placed one of the glasses in front of me and the other at his place setting. And then the oven timer went off, and I knew it was my chance. If I was wrong, and he hadn't spiked my drink, then no harm done, right? And so with my heart pounding in my chest, I quickly switched the champagne glasses around. It felt like I was doing something you only ever see in movies, but literally in real life. I expected Robbie to appear any second, and if it had been a movie, I would have completed the switch with just milliseconds to spare, but it felt like he didn't return to the table for another 5 minutes at least. When he did, the dish on offer was a decent-looking mac and cheese. Okay, so maybe he and Dan over-exaggerated Robbie's culinary skills a bit. It did look like a good mac and cheese in fairness, and it's hard to get mac and cheese wrong, really. Now, I was a bit wary about eating any of his food, though. If he had spiked my drink, but then he'd served up his own portion of mac and cheese, and I realized he obviously wasn't going to drug himself. I also found it very amusingly Robbie-like that he served up his own food before offering me mine. It looked like I was going to be helping myself, so I did just that. Robbie kept encouraging me to try the champagne because it was a particularly great one, and so I took a casual sip. He did the same and then took a bigger sip, and he matched me. It was something of a running joke that we had whenever we went out drinking, really, and as we started eating, Robbie was talking about work, and to my dismay, I could hear his words begin to slur. I suggested he drink some more champagne, and he did, and then he drained the whole glass. Now, pretty soon, he was displaying all the telltale signs of being roofied. I hadn't been wrong. My heart dropped when I realized how real this was. Robbie had really spiked my drink. Now, obviously, I know what to look out for with that kind of stuff, and I know what they do, so I knew Robbie would be suggestible, and so I just came straight out and asked him why he'd spiked my drink. He kind of giggled and said that he wanted to try me out. I told him he had a boyfriend and I thought he was gay, and he said that he'd never said that. He liked women every now and then, but it wasn't as fun when we knew about it. Apparently, he got off on the surprise, and I felt sick and disgusted. Eventually, I got him to admit that he'd roofied at least 4 other people, 3 of which were women, and that Dan knew about it and was kind of a kink to them. If I'd remotely been thinking straight, I would have recorded his confession, although I know now that it wouldn't have done any good. Finally, disgusted and terrified at Robbie's betrayal, I said that I was leaving. Robbie started laughing and saying that he missed me already, and then passed out face first into his plate of mac and cheese. I left him snoring in that sauce and went straight to the nearest police station. When I got done telling the officer everything that happened, I didn't exactly get the answer I wanted to hear. It was my word against Robbie's, and unless he had security cameras inside his apartment and provided the footage to us, then really all we could prove had happened was that I roofied him. The cop, who was clearly sympathetic and felt bad for me, suggested that it was probably in my best interest not to pursue any charges, given how things had played out. Unfortunately, I didn't have the names of any of the other people Robbie admitted to roofing, and really all I could do was hope to hell that this experience had scared him out of trying it again. Now, I'm not entirely sure what he did learn from the experience, though, because I never saw or heard from him again. He just didn't show up to work for the next week. He didn't call in sick or quit. He just pulled a complete vanishing act. And when the other managers tried to call him, his number was no longer in service. I tried to track Dan down, but there was no luck there either. Nobody had seen him at the bar that we hung out at, and apparently he'd never worked at that law firm Robbie had claimed. It was all just completely weird, a very frustrating mystery, and ultimately I'm glad that Robbie is now out of my life, and I have my own theories about why he and Dan both disappeared. I can only hope one of my theories is right, because it would mean Robbie's no longer a danger to anyone. It's deeply frustrating knowing that a potential criminal like that can be out there, but then I have to remind myself that he's just one of many. My heart breaks for his alleged past victims, and while I wish there was more I could do, I'm just very lucky that Robbie's betrayal didn't lead to a far worse outcome for me. I've watched nearly all of your videos, and recently I've been hanging out in your live streams, and from what I can tell, you're a bit of a gamer. And if I recall, you're big into first-person shooters and Fortnite. Now please forgive me if I've gotten that wrong. But the point is, I'm sure you're familiar with and have probably played Halo Combat Evolved. I played through the first game with my friend Kieran when we were just little kids. I was lucky enough to get an Xbox at launch, and then when Halo 2 came out, we played it together in co-op as well. And Halo 3, same story, ODST, co-op with Kieran. Halo Reach, you better believe we played it. And then Halo 4 came out, and it was the start of our senior year. At the beginning of November, I remember it quite well. I'd been dating a girl at the time for about over a year at this point, and tragically her grandmother passed on the weekend of November 3rd. However, we live in California, and the grandmother lived in Rhode Island. My girlfriend only had her father since her mother died young, and I offered to go with her, which would mean leaving on the 5th and staying beyond the funeral, which was the 9th. Basically, I wouldn't be back in California until November 15th. The school was understanding. They gave me work to catch up with while I was away, and my girlfriend was homeschooled, so it really wasn't an issue for her. Everyone understood why I was taking the time out to accompany Jess cross-country to be with her during her beloved grandmother's funeral and wake. And that's everyone except Kieran. I remember telling him just offhand without really thinking about it, and he just went quiet. He frowned and mouthed some things silently to himself, a habit he had when he was working things out. And then he was all, "What about Halo 4? Now, I was a bit taken aback. I said it was fine, we could just play it when I got back, but Kieran was persistent. We played all the other games in co-op at launch. How could we break the streak with 4? I tried pointing out to him that I didn't really have a choice. I explained that my girlfriend's beloved grandmother had literally died and she needed someone with her for the following events. Now, at first I thought Kieran was joking because of how mad he got. But no, he was serious. He was genuinely accusing me of putting Jess before our friendship. And he even used the phrase bros before hoes at one point. And no matter how much I tried to explain to him that this was just a video game and the death of a loved one was a little more important, he wasn't having any of it. Now it ended with him throwing my Xbox 360 pad to the floor and breaking it into pieces and then storming out of my house. I was taken aback. I tried calling and texting him in the 2 weeks before we left for Rhode Island, but he either left me on read or hung up on me. Now, I have no choice but to try and put Kieran to the back of my mind and spend all my time emotionally supporting Jess. It was a beautiful service, and Jess had a huge family. They were all welcoming and made me feel like one of them, and I soon forgot about my lunatic friend, and by the end of the trip, I felt like I'd genuinely known Grandma and genuinely felt a sense of emotion for her. I'd left my car in Jess's driveway, so when we finally returned home, we all said our goodbyes. Exhausted, emotional, and even more convinced that Jess was the one, I drove home. Immediately I could see something was wrong. The front window was smashed in, and the door was covered in a certain piece of phallic graffiti. Inside, the place had been trashed. Just everything had been broken. The TV, my Xbox, my PlayStation 3. Someone had taken a knife to the couch and cut it into pieces. Most of the rest of the room were untouched, and then I went into my bedroom. All my posters had been slashed up. My smaller TV was smashed on the floor, but the worst was the bed. It was covered in both urine and feces and had clearly been that way for a few days. Thankfully, my parents' room was locked. They were away for an extended period of time on some cruise, hence why the house was free to be vandalized. I guess none of the neighbors, who were mostly probably junkies honestly, had thought to alert us or call the cops when they'd seen the broken window or the graffiti junk. I called the cops and then immediately started asking around the neighborhood. Nobody had seen anything, and then finally, I hit upon a stroke of luck. My elderly neighbor across the street had a security camera. Now this was 2012, so they were hardly sophisticated back then, but I was able to see the footage and there was no way of identifying the guy breaking in. He wore a mask and a hoodie. But I knew. I knew the walk, their gait, the slight limp from a skateboard accident, the nervous way he'd dart around. It was obviously my friend Kieran. I told the cops my theory, and of course Kieran had some alibi. Surprisingly, he had other friends and they claimed that he was with them that night. But I knew it was him. We never spoke again, and Jess and I eventually got married and are still happily together today, so I guess it was all worth it. But ultimately, my friend since elementary school was enough of a terrifying psycho to destroy my entire living room, piss all over my bed, and worse, because I couldn't play Halo with him on launch day. Thankfully, my family had home insurance and a lot of costs were covered, but I still had to pay a bunch of money out that I couldn't afford. I stick to single-player games these days or couch co-op with Jess. I think it's easier to understand why. Anytime any of my online buddies ask if I want to game with them, I just tell them that I'm not really into video games, and I've never played Halo since. I'm writing in on behalf of my older parents, who I'm sad to say aren't listeners. They're more of the crime shows on TV type, I'm afraid, and don't really listen to YouTuber channels. That doesn't stop me and my older kids from being huge fans, though, and it's been a long time coming for us to write into you because our family has a long-term, ongoing creepy story about the wildest friends to enemies incident I ever experienced. Now, for some backstory, this all started after I'd finished college and moved into what would turn out to be my forever home with my boyfriend, who became my husband, but sadly hasn't stayed my forever partner since then. And now that myself and my two brothers had moved out of the family home, my parents decided to downsize. They moved into a nice little suburban cottage, and we helped them settle in. One of the first things Mom told me about, with a nice little glow in her voice, was how lovely the elderly neighbors were. They were a couple in their 70s, apparently, who'd been together since high school. They were very fit and active, and in the 2 weeks that my parents had already lived there, they'd become fast friends. The neighbors, who I'll just call Mr. and Mrs. Awful, for good reasons, had made sure Mom and Dad settled into the neighborhood very well. They brought home-baked goods around almost every other day. They'd introduced them to the other neighbors, and it had been nothing but wonderful. Their son worked as the owner of a fresh fish distribution company for the local market, so the family was decently well off. Mom and Dad didn't have a huge amount of friends. They'd both been extremely career-focused until they retired. My brothers and I all agreed that it was great to see them socializing some, and Mr. and Mrs. Awful seemed like the perfect neighbors. What could possibly go wrong? Well, oh my God, the answer is everything. Hate is a strong word, and I don't think I've ever actually hated anyone before, but hand on my heart, I hate Mr. and Mrs. Awful. They seem like such a sweet, lovely couple too, and the first time I met them, it was like I had a new set of grandparents. It all started to go wrong when my parents first went on vacation. They'd been living at the new property for a few months, but this post-retirement vacation was something they'd had booked for years. They probably wouldn't have gone on vacation so soon after moving into a new house, but it was a cruise and a once-in-a-lifetime type thing. Unfortunately, the plan had been for my brother to house sit for them, to look after the cats, and everything fell through. I forget exactly why, something to do with him getting sudden contract work, but it resulted in my parents scrambling trying to find someone to feed the cats during the 2 weeks they were away. I suggested that they ask the Awfuls, and of course, Mom loved that idea. The Awfuls were only too happy to agree to it. They loved our cats, they said, and Mom was pretty stressed out because they're both indoor cats, and she was worried that the Awfuls wouldn't really grasp that. They seemed perfectly understanding of the concept of indoor cats, though, and in fact, they had an old cat until recently who'd lived entirely indoors. They'd make sure that the cats didn't get out and would spend a few hours a day with them even, which was perfect. Now anyway, before going away, my parents installed a couple of small security cameras in a few of the rooms. They weren't going to, but I kind of convinced them. They were worried that it felt like a betrayal to the Awfuls, but I convinced them that it's better to be safe than sorry. And besides, what if someone broke in or the cats did something insane? It's just better to install them and have them hidden but plugged in and connected to a laptop upstairs to record any movement. So my parents get back from vacation, and the cats seemed excited to see them, and so did the Awfuls. Everything seemed like it had gone so perfect, in fact, that my folks didn't even think about checking the security camera footage for a week or so. And in fact, I was the one who checked it when I dropped by for our regular Sunday lunch with the kids and then husband. While the rest of my family were playing some complicated board game that I hated, I decided to go upstairs and just check the laptop to see if my setup had actually worked. But what I saw had left me speechless. The cameras weren't great quality or anything, and they only seemed to start recording occasionally. But what I saw across a few different cameras left me shocked. The Awfuls happily and recklessly just went digging through my parents' things. Talk about nosy. They went through drawers and cupboards, and some days they didn't even show up to feed the cats, and when they did, they were weirdly mean to them, kicking out at them and pushing them away constantly. And at one point, one of the cats escaped. Mr. Awful went running outside after her and came back in with the animal under his arm 5 minutes later. He violently threw her across the room. Thankfully, she jumped onto the couch and landed safely, and I could see him saying something angrily, and the cameras didn't have audio, sadly. I showed all of this to my parents, and they loved their cats as much as they loved their kids. They went storming over to the Awfuls, hammered on their door, and then waited for an answer. When it was answered, my dad just said that they'd watched security footage from their cat-sitting week, and that they'd appreciate it if the couple never spoke to or acknowledged them again. If we could leave it there, it would end there. And the elderly Mr. Awful replied with something like, "Your wife was always a C-word." Anyway, and slammed the door. We assumed that was it, and it was, for at least a month. And during that time, against my advice, my parents removed the security cameras because they were unsettling. And I strongly suggested that this was a bad idea given that the Awfuls could retaliate, but they're boomers, what do you expect? It really was unfortunate because one day my parents went out for a day trip with a local community center. When they came home, a side window had been slid open. Mom swears that she locked it but can't be sure, and the house itself seemed untouched. No robbery, no vandalism, but it certainly wasn't untouched. No. The house itself absolutely stank like hell itself. I've never smelled anything like it. And at first I prayed that the Awfuls had thrown a load of stink bombs or something around, expired ones based on the smell. But it was worse than that. Every single toilet in the house was filled, and I mean filled, with the most disgusting bowel evacuation you could imagine. None of it was solid, and let me stress here that this was 3 different toilets. Either the culprit had the biggest, most rotten guts of all time, or they'd been saving the produce for this exact moment. But it was strange. They could have thrown it around the house. They could have absolutely destroyed my parents' property with poo, but instead they just filled the toilets with it. Well, it was disgusting, vile really, and it took hours to even begin to get rid of the smell. But we did get rid of the stuff itself by simply flushing the toilets. It just seemed like we were missing something, and looking back now, I can't help but feel that there was an evil genius behind the plan the offals cooked up. 4 days later, the smell came back, only it wasn't quite the same. The parents had been in and out of the house so naturally that they became paranoid that a toilet had been filled again. But no, nothing. In fact, the bathrooms were bizarrely less disgusting than other rooms. The living room was the worst, and then the kitchen, the utility room, and then the hallway, which almost seemed to have a smell which was hidden more than the others. And it just got worse and worse. One night, shortly after my husband had left, in fact to run away with his parents' soulmate, I received a phone call. It was my mom, begging to come stay with me. My home was miserable with the kids missing their dad, and I didn't think my parents joining us would actually be a good idea. I asked why, and she explained that they could no longer tolerate the smell. It was ruining their lives, and they wanted to move out of their perfect bungalow. And I kind of lost it. I said that was it. We were getting to the bottom of this, and we'd already had a guy to check out the drains, so it wasn't that. I knew the smell of dead rats or mice or raccoons, so it wasn't a dead rodent stuck somewhere else. This was almost fishy. And then it struck me. An old prank that one frat had played on a guy back in my college days. They had a fish in his car for a week until it stank really bad, but it was nothing. Nothing compared to this. But I did remember it being similar. And I told my parents to go out for the day and called both my brothers. We went around and searched absolutely everywhere in that bungalow where we might find a dead mackerel or two. And it was far worse than that. And please, hold on to your stomachs if you're squeamish. 2 rotten octopi, 7 mackerel, over 15 other similar fish, a bunch of crabs and lobsters, a bunch of small, liquefying fish. And the worst was when my brother opened the hatch to the loft and an entire rotting tuna fell onto him. If you've never seen the size of a tuna, Google it. And this thing was... I don't even want to describe it. So we bagged up all the fish, including as much of the liquid rot that we could find, and we took them out to the backyard. And then we did another search, and another. And then we filled the house with air spray and fresheners and all sorts of devices, and then we did another search. And by the time we were confident that we'd gotten everything, it was evening time, and we paid for a hotel for our parents that night, and they returned to their property the next day. Dad didn't even pause to think. He grabbed up the ultra-thick garbage bags of fish and stormed over to the offals. If you recall, their son owned a goddamn fishery. Our theory, which was never confirmed but it was obviously right, is that the toilet incident was a distraction to try and cause us to focus on the plumbing when the smell came back. Then, when we couldn't fix it, my parents would leave. Why had the offals betrayed them? We still had no idea. When Dad knocked on the door, Mr. Awful opened it. Dad didn't even give him a chance to speak, and instead, he was ready and threw the contents of the most foul of the garbage bags all over Mr. Awful and the hallway. He managed to get a second bag too, and then a third that coated their front door. He dumped the remaining 2 bags on their doorstep and left. Now we all kind of expected a visit from the cops, but there was none. Likely, the Awfuls had no idea how much proof we had of their guilt. I guess they'd checked for security cameras since they knew it was a safe place for the fish. But who knows what goes on in the head of people like this? Instead, the Awfuls went on vacation the next day. While they were away, my mom and dad received a letter. It was from Mrs. Awful. I don't have the letter on hand, but I can remember the majority of the insane woman's ramblings. Dear, my mom's name. If you're wondering why it might appear as if we betrayed you, then perhaps ask yourself if you betrayed us first. We've invited you over to dinner so many times, and not once have you commented on any of the new ornaments or home decor we've bought since you first visited. It's rude, ignorant, and insulting. We gave you a small taste of what you made us feel, and then some other ramblings. Now, if you think this story is bizarre, the ending is even more crazy. While the Awfuls were on vacation, we saw on the local news that a certain fishery had been raided, both for tax fraud and for smuggling cocaine inside shipments of cod. Apparently, the owner's elderly parents, who had owned the business before them, had also been involved in said racket and continued to be involved, and so we didn't even have to go to the cops with that lunatic letter. We didn't have to say a word, we just sat back and watched as their own actions ruined their own lives. I cannot get my head around the reason why career criminals and drug smugglers engaged in such insanely ludicrous revenge. My only theory is, watching the son on television, he seemed like an adult frat boy, and I'm pretty sure all the ideas came from him and his parents went along with them. I've never met a more insane family in my life, and I hope I never do, but I do hope they're having fun in prison, and I really hope they're forced to eat seafood every day, forever. This is kind of a sad story for me to tell, even years later. It just reminds me of the worst of the human condition, and I hate being reminded of that. I do believe humans are inherently good, and have done since I was an adult, but at the time of the story, I kind of thought most people were a-holes, honestly. And this is because of how I'd been treated from kindergarten to middle school. You see, I have a birthmark on my face, and I'll be honest, it's not the easiest one to look at for the average person. It's not one of those skin discoloration birthmarks, but it's a series of lumps and, I don't know, roughness. They look like acne scars, but they're not. They're part of my skin structure. I've had so many tests as a kid to see if it was something worse, but it really is just a facial feature that I was born with, and it covers most half of my face. Now, I've never met anyone else with something similar, at least anywhere near the size that mine is. And yeah, it's still there in my mid-30s. I don't want it removed now. I want people to have to face it, pun intended. Now, even since I can remember from a little kid, I've had people calling me freak and other horrible things when I was out in public. Complete strangers for the most part. They just decided to see a child and tell the child and his parents how repulsive he is and how he shouldn't be allowed out. Now, if you don't think this kind of thing happens, talk to anyone with a very visible deformity and you'll be shocked. I grew up used to it, and I don't want to imply that every person I met or every kid I encountered was a hostile piece of crap, but the fact is, most were perfectly lovely about everything. I had a group of friends in every year. I did notice that that group was shrinking as I got older and kids became more self-conscious and more aware of their own health and mortality, but it is what it is. At the beginning of summer break between grades 7 and 8, we moved to a different house and moved states as well. Part of me dreaded this because it was a whole new group of people to call me freak. At least when you heard it from the same knuckle-draggers every day, it became much easier to ignore. On the other hand, I was excited because my kid sister was excited, and if there was anyone in the world who was the most sympathetic and kind to me about my birthmark, it was her. We'd been moved in for a couple of weeks, and thankfully I was glad to be on summer vacation. Batman the Animated Series had become really big with kids my age, and I just knew that Two-Face was going to be one of the prime insults that I'd have to endure that year. Looking back, being called a crime lord Batman villain wouldn't have been too bad. Unfortunately, they picked Clayface instead, which wasn't quite as cool. I mostly played in the woods behind my house, either alone or occasionally with my sister. She was only 6 and couldn't go too far, play too hard, so I did most of my exploring alone. Now one day I stumbled on a group of 5 kids. Well, it turns out they were the same age as me, about to move up to 8th grade. 2 girls and 3 boys. They were clearly building some treehouse and had been friends for a long time, and I just stood there looking for a while, kind of daydreaming about making friends like these. And then one of the boys, the leader, noticed me, and I braced myself for a torrent of abuse. Instead, he told me to stop being such a weirdo and come hang out. Now, I did see him shoot the others this sort of warning look, like saying, anything in your dead meat, and that was it. And we spent the rest of the day building the treehouse. I was a pretty good architect at that age, having spent a lot of time building huts and treehouses by myself. By the time we all had to go home for dinner, I think we'd actually become pretty good friends. There was this kid named Freddie, he was the leader, and then there was Rob and Phil, who were brothers, and they were the boys, and then there was a very tall girl named Juliet, and oh my god, the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen, and her name was Grace. Now that night, I just stayed awake for hours, staring at some crack in the ceiling, daydreaming about the future friendship that we'd all have. Staring at that crack was one of the most beautiful experiences in my life. I understood then why people lay in bed staring at cracks in the ceilings and why so many ceilings had cracks. It was fate, imperfection, just like me. And then I jerked off and fell asleep. I met up with the gang most days that summer. We had so many amazing memories, riding shopping carts in the Walmart parking lot, drinking Slurpees outside the 7-Eleven, teaching each other martial arts. I was actually a black belt in Taekwondo, so I was able to show the others a few moves. Now, the first big event happened one day when the boys and Juliet had gone somewhere or other, and Grace sat next to me on the wall, on my birthmark side, and shuffled closer to me. I suddenly felt fingertips brushing my cheek and touching the bumps. I realized that was the first time anyone who wasn't a family member or a medical professional had actually touched my birthmark. And then Grace planted a very gentle kiss on my cheek, jumped down off the wall, and sort of skipped off, and she didn't even look back. That night, I stared at the crack in the ceiling again, thinking about things, but mostly Grace. And then a spider ran across the ceiling and frightened the crap out of me, ruining the moment. Now, thankfully, I managed to squash it with a Nike shoe that I had and got some sleep. When I arrived at the treehouse the next day, I could hear the others were already up there, earlier than we'd discussed. It was only 3 days until school started, and we were all really nervous about that, or so they said. When I climbed up into the treehouse, I was taken aback by a few things. One, all my friends had nasty, cruel looks on their faces. 2, Grace was sitting extremely close to Freddie and was now holding hands with him. Freddie said something similar to, "Oh, look, it's the freak." And then it all came out. They were tired of pretending, tired of stringing me on. Someone like me didn't deserve to live. I was God's mistake, which, in my opinion, he doesn't make, but they wanted me to feel joy and friendship only to strip it away from me. They paid Grace $10 to kiss me on the cheek and said it was the most vile thing she'd ever done. She told me she had nightmares about it all night. The others chimed in too, with every slur I'd heard before and some new ones added on top of that. Rob actually was the first person to call me Clayface, and oh boy did he make sure that one stuck throughout 8th grade. Freddie and Grace told me that they were going to make my final year of middle school a living hell. They were pretty popular, and if they told everyone that I was some freak, then I guess I just was. They started listing off these rumors they'd planned to spread. I was so ugly the only way that I could get with a girl was to force myself on her. And my parents tried to put me up for adoption every year until I was 10. I was thrown out of 3 schools for being too gross, all sorts of stuff. And then before I could open my mouth and say anything, they told me that if I said a word of this, if I breathed a word of any of the bullying or reported it, then I wouldn't be the only member of my family to have a deformed face. Wouldn't it be interesting if my kid sister had a scar on the other side, they said. I said nothing, and instead they commanded me down from the treehouse, made me strip down to my boxers, and tied me to a nearby tree. And then they left. I didn't say a word, nothing. I didn't even call out for help because I genuinely wanted to just stay there and die. It took over 18 hours and a literal search party to find me. I just said some older guys had done it, some high school or college age, and I never once ratted on my fake friends or the 99% of that 8th grade who followed them in bullying me. I didn't have a much better time in high school. Now, college was better. People were less rude, but my self-hatred grew. And one day, in the dorm room kitchen, I tried to set the birthmark side of my face on fire because at least a burn scar might draw some sympathy. A very kind roommate doused the flames almost immediately. And now, not to be crass, but I make a ridiculous amount of money giving talks on disability and deformity, and I haven't kept track on most of the bullies in my life, but I did keep an eye on Freddie, Rob, Phil, Juliet, and Grace. And the following events happened over the last 30 years. I don't want to say that I believe in karma, but make of this what you will. Freddie eventually became a heroin addict, and had to have his arm amputated at the elbow. Rob and Phil were in a car accident. Rob developed a severe permanent limp, and Phil lost an eyeball. Juliet was thrown off her horse as an instructor and actually broke her spine, and she's confined to a wheelchair for life. Nothing ever happened to Grace, though, and I wonder if anything will. I didn't want any of this to happen to any of them, but I can't help finding it interesting that 4 out of the 5 of those people now have permanent disfigurements. Every night I pray to God that it's just some coincidence, that karma isn't real, and that Grace will be saved from any retribution. I forgive everyone who's ever treated me this way, and I still do. Otherwise, the alternative is too scary to think about. I don't think that I'd be Clayface. I don't think that I'd even be Two-Face. Honestly, if it ever came down to it, I'd probably be the Punisher. So this was a strange and absolutely baffling incident of betrayal that I can't get my head round to this day. Just bizarre and strange and terrifying. It all started when the girls at work invited me on a night out. This wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of either. I usually attended. There had never been a problem before. We crawled a few bars and did some karaoke. There were about 5 of us, so we decided to walk to the taxi area down the block. Now, before I even had time to react, a very fit-looking man dressed entirely in black with a balaclava sprinted past me and stole my purse. Well, crap. There goes everything, I guess. Bank cards, phones, mementos, all the crap that you accumulate over the years in there. And when I got home, I was just sobbing and in tears. Now, my hubby, who'd waited up for me, asked what was wrong, and I told him everything, and that I was going to report the theft to the cops. Now, my significant other was a police officer, a uniformed officer, so I expected him to be all for it and offer me a fast track or something. I don't know. But instead, he absolutely adamantly told me that going to the cops was probably a bad idea, and he said that they'd make me feel like crap, they'd make things worse, and they'd try and imply that somehow it was my fault. He said the best thing that we could do is just urgently cancel the cards and the phone and just move on. Now, I wasn't comfortable about this, but like I said, he was a cop himself. Why would he be wrong, really? And so he was incredible after that. Super supportive and thoughtful, and he helped me cancel everything and buy me a new bag. In return, I guess I was a lot more affectionate with him and spent more time with him. We were only in our late 20s, but I'd always had a really low intimacy drive, so I started pushing myself to be more up for it, as they say. He was being such a sweetheart that he deserved a reward, and even started getting me from work every day instead of me insisting that I walked home with the girls. He was always by my side. Months later, I was doing some spring cleaning while hubby was up north visiting his parents, who I didn't really get along with. And so I was going through the guest room, cleaning it out, when I found a black sack with a few items in it. I didn't recognize most of them. They were just small keepsakes, like lockets or a Tamagotchi, a really weird collection. But then I found this old, folded photo in there. A photo of me and my deceased mom on vacation in Florida when I was 15. A photo that had been in my purse when it was snatched because I kept it sealed in a side compartment there. A photo my husband could only have if he had been the purse snatcher. Now, as soon as he got home, I confronted him. I expected him to deny it, but he just didn't. Instead, he asked, "Couldn't I see? Couldn't I see that he'd done a good thing? We were much closer now, emotionally and physically. Our relationship was better." Yeah, thanks to a violent, deceptive betrayal, I thought. And then I asked him about the other items. Now, he stuttered for a moment and then claimed that he had to practice bag snatching a few times to make sure that he got mine right. Sure, buddy. And you had to practice keeping those keepsakes, too. I think he snatched more bags after mine and got a taste for it. He told me if I reported him to the cops, he would do some terrible things. Maybe I did the wrong thing here, but I just wanted away from him. I told him that I wouldn't report him to the cops if he agreed to a divorce and promised never to come looking for me. He told me that without me, he might still do some terrible things, maybe to himself, and I said that was up to him. And he collapsed onto the couch and agreed to the divorce. Once the pleasantly simple legal issues were dealt with, I never saw that freak again. I don't know if I did the right thing by not reporting him, but I am convinced that that scared him straight, and I hope I'm right. To my ex-husband, you betrayed me in a way that I can never fully grasp and never forgive. And I hope that keeps you up at night, every night, and that you never find love again. Not that I'm vindictive or anything, but maybe don't have a long relationship and marry me and then mug me in the middle of the night. Then we don't have a problem. So I have a really messed up story about my grandmother, Clarice. So between the ages of 4 and 8, from what we can gather, her mother was poisoning her. My grandma was this sickly child, but back then, medical doctors weren't quite so competent and thorough, and so she was just given some nebulous medicine and was forced to grow up dealing with regular throwing up. She could barely keep food down. She was crazy weak and only attended school once a week, if that. She had some friends who tried their best to make her feel more cheerful. One of her friends, Betsy, dropped by unannounced one day. The front door was slightly open, and so she just kind of walked in because she was that kind of brazen girl. And there she saw great-grandmother preparing some soup over the stove. She dished out a bowl and then reached up into the cupboard for a box, and then using that box, she scattered a tiny amount of powder into the soup. Betsy recognized it right away because her dad had a barn. It was rat poison. Great-grandma was poisoning my poor grandmother. Betsy quickly snuck out of the house before anyone could see her, thank God. She told her parents exactly what she'd seen. Her parents weren't the type to disbelieve their daughter, but apparently the town had been gossiping a little about what was making little Clary sick, and as soon as Betsy described the box of rat poison to her father perfectly, he marched her to the local sheriff's office and passed the conversation over to Betsy. Betsy was a real firecracker, and I am grateful that I got to meet her as an old woman. She's still alive now, although Granny Clarice sadly isn't. And so when Betsy demanded that the sheriff go out to Clarice's place with a few deputies and do a welfare check, well, the story goes that he was too darn scared to say no to this 8-year-old girl. She described exactly where the poison was, and there was no reason for great-grandma to have moved it. The cops burst in. They found the poison, and they found the soup only half eaten. And it was able to be tested, and traces of the rat poison were found. Grandma went to live with her aunt and uncle, who lived on the same street as Betsy, and made a miraculous recovery, or as miraculous as it can be when you're no longer ingesting poison. Grandma loved telling that story, and Betsy still loves telling her part, so I'm sure if you read this out loud and I play that story to Betsy, you'll become her favorite person. But good God, talk about the worst kind of betrayal. I know it's a mental illness, this Munchausen's by proxy, and I'm very sympathetic towards mental health, but this is one that I really, really struggle with. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.